Filming in low light can be pretty difficult, and one of the best tips I can give you is to use the light that you have to your advantage. So I'm not saying use moonlight, but some lamps or something practical in the environment that you are in filming. We are on the Lumix S5. Got a light up there. If you don't have any extra lights on hand, like little LEDs or something like that to help fill in the light, one of the things you can do is have a 5-in-1. So what these are little pop-out reflectors. They kind of work like sun visors for a car. And one side is usually silver or gold to reflect, and the other side is black to block out any light. And you can take these off, use the diffuser in it, and they're pretty cheap. And the main thing for this is that you can use the reflective side to bounce the light that you already have back onto your subject, just to add more light in the environment. Right there, look at that. Obviously, the more light you can get in, the better result you're gonna have. And the same could be said for your camera's sensor. So camera sensors come in different sizes. They can come super small on action cameras like these guys have here. They can go up to bigger sizes like a Micro Four Thirds or an APS-C sensor like I have on this Canon M50. And one of the biggest sensors that you can get in a digital camera without breaking the bank is a full frame sensor. And that's what I'm using on the camera I'm filming right now with my Lumix S5. Because of the size of the sensor, it's able to let in more light photons hit that sensor so that you have a better image in low light. As a rule of thumb, smaller sensors are going to be worse, where bigger sensors are going to be better because bigger allows more light to hit it. Of course, this can vary between different camera manufacturers and the dynamic range that each sensor allows, but usually the bigger sensor is going to be more beneficial in low light. I'm not telling you to exchange your crop sensor camera for a bigger full frame camera. There are some ways to get around that. One of them is being a speed booster. I have a speed booster here on my Canon M50. If I take off the lens, you can see that it looks like the regular lens mount, but there is a glass filament inside there. What the glass does in the speed booster is allow more light to come in, and actually an added benefit to it, it can make your lenses a lot wider. So if you're on a 35mm, it may look somewhere closer to like a 28mm. Of course, this is different between what kind of speed booster you get. Not every speed booster is going to be the same. Some of them may let more or less light in, but just be sure to look on the description just to see what it can do for your camera. If you get a speed booster with these contact points like mine, it will actually tell you what your f-stop is, so you can see what it was before you added the speed booster and what it'd be like after adding a speed booster to see how much more light your lens is going to be letting in. When it comes to the actual video quality and low light for your camera, I have seen some people say that if you go without using a log profile, like just the standard or Rec 709 color profile, that it will yield a better result. It'll be less noise. I haven't really seen too much to suggest that. The only thought that I can think of is if you have a camera that shoots in 10-bit color like the Lumix S5 does 422 10-bit, that has a bigger dynamic range, so that if I was in low light with a log profile, I can still get a pretty clean image. But if I was to push that down to 8-bit Rec 709 standard color profile, when I go back to color grade, it will introduce a lot more grain. But that's kind of one of those things where it just kind of depends on the camera that you're using. My suggestion, if you have the ability to shoot log, do it. If your camera doesn't, just go with something standard, but turn down the sharpening. If you have that sharpening dialed up, the digital sharpening on there, all the little pixels of the noise will start to sharpen up with it. So just to mitigate that, I would do that. Another thing, some cameras actually have a built-in denoiser. I think that it probably is better not to use it. I feel like it may just really smooth everything out and not have a really well-looking picture, except for just getting rid of a little bit of noise. However, it's one of those things, just test it out to see if your camera has that, if it's gonna actually be beneficial for you. This next point I wanna bring up is utilizing zebras. And I'm not talking about the animal, it's actually an exposure tool that some cameras have, some don't. One of the best things you can do is use a color checker just to get the exposure at the color of whatever your subject is. But go ahead and check in your settings of your camera to see if you have this, and you can usually set the zebra to a certain exposure point. And that way you can go out and film all you want in the low light, and whenever you see the zebras pop up on your subject, you know that you have good proper exposure on it. If you're already pretty knowledgeable with cameras, you may know what I'm about to talk about, but if you're not, do listen because it's going to be pretty helpful for you, and that is your shutter speed. Typically what you want is a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I want a 1/48 shutter speed. However, most mirrorless cameras do a 1/50, which is the closest thing you can actually get to that. And with most cinema cameras, you actually have a shutter angle, and that'll usually be set to 180 degrees. The reason you want it set to this is because it has the most natural motion blur that you get on your image. And in low light, you may have to crank that shutter speed down. I'm not suggesting to do that right away, but it is something that you can use to your advantage to let in more light. So all the shutter speed is the amount of time that your shutter is left open to let light in before it closes to take the image of that frame. If you leave it open longer, you're gonna have more light in, but when you do that, the more blurrier the image gets. So if anything, just go to the next slower shutter speed and see how that looks. But again, I would not recommend doing this unless if you have no other way of getting your image to be any brighter, or if you just want a cool, creative, artistic look to it. The second best investment to that of your camera body is going to be your camera's lens. And if you're shooting in low light, chances are you do not want to use your kit lens that came with your camera. And if they are a zoom, which most of them usually are, when you zoom in, that f-stop is going to get stopped down even more, maybe to an f5.6, thus letting less light hit the sensor and giving you an even more noisy image. And that's where prime lenses come in. If you don't know what a prime lens is, it's pretty much just a fancy way of saying a non-zoomable lens. And no, you don't have to go out and buy the most expensive one. I have quite a few cheap ones. There's one I'll have popping up right here that I got on Amazon for like 90 bucks. The one I'm holding here is a vintage one, which I do suggest going with vintage glass. You're gonna have a way more creative look with these things. I got this one for 180 bucks off of eBay, and it is a 58 millimeter, and it is an f2.0. And this is the Helios 44-2. And one of the craziest things about this lens is that they shot the newest Batman movie, the car chase scene, on this lens. If you know what I'm talking about, it was shot at night with very, very low light. And it was a movie shot on this lens that you can get for like $180. It's ridiculous. But the great thing is with primes, they usually have a faster aperture, so you're letting in more light with these. One thing to keep in mind though, is that if you open your aperture all the way open, so like this one's at f2, if I go all the way to f2, it's gonna be a lot harder to focus. Yes, it's gonna be way bright, it's gonna have that nice blurry background, but the focal plane is gonna be shrunk by a lot. But if you do end up wanting it all the way open, if you do buy one of these vintage lenses that doesn't have autofocus, it's gonna be very, very hard to focus. So I do suggest getting something like this focus pull where you have a little gear on it and you just line it up to a gear on your camera lens, and then you can pull focus that way. If you wanna make sure that you're in focus a lot more, stop down, don't be wide open to whatever the lowest is of your camera. And usually what I suggest is just going a stop above. So if I had, like this one is an f2, I would probably go to a 2.8 or maybe like a 3.5. It really just depends. Now they've got lenses out of the way, the other thing you want to know is your camera's ISO. And if you don't know what ISO stands for, it's right here because I always forget what the acronym is, but essentially it's just the light sensitivity that your camera sensor has. And every camera is different, but the one thing you want to know is your camera's base ISO. So it can also be called native ISO, and some cameras have both. So for instance, my Canon M50 only has one base ISO, my Lumix S5 has a dual native ISO. And all that pretty much means is that at this number, you can get the brightest amount of image on your camera sensor before it starts introducing more noise onto that image. So for my Lumix S5, it goes from 640 ISO to 4000 ISO. But anywhere in between that, like if I'm around 2500 ISO, it's gonna start introducing noise, but as soon as I push that dial to 4000 on the ISO, it just cleans the image right up. So you do wanna make sure to Google what your camera's base ISO is. If you don't know, or you're just kinda guessing, a good rule of thumb is if it is just a regular mirrorless camera, it's probably around 800 ISO. and if it is like an action camera, you're probably gonna be closer to 400 ISO. Rules are meant to be broken, so don't obviously always stick to that native ISO if you can't get your subject or environment properly exposed like you're wanting to. So feel free to go up a little bit higher, but just remember that you're gonna have more noise in your image. And that's where denoising comes into place. So like I said earlier, there are some cameras that have a denoiser in it, but you can do that in post. And one free way to do this is just dropping a little bit of blur on the image and then sharpen it back up. You can do that really simple in DaVinci Resolve. And if you do have the paid studio version of DaVinci Resolve, it has its own built-in denoiser. And there are other plugins you can get. I think Red Giant has one for Premiere Pro, but just remember that if you get one of those denoisers, they usually are a paid plugin. If you tried everything I've mentioned and it's still not helping you get a good looking image in low light, then the only thing I have left for you is just to buy a light.